start. So I would like to once again say hello. My name is Zakina Reed. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Diversio EDU, and I am pleased to introduce today's speaker, Matteo Stewart. Matteo is an inclusive leadership facilitator, a three-time international TEDx speaker, a belonging practitioner, and senior inclusive leadership facilitator here with Diversio EDU. With over 30 years of experience, Matteo's yes and approach has guided senior leaders across North America in industries ranging from healthcare and global asset management to nonprofits, the Olympics, Paralympics, Pan Am Games, and even film production. In today's session, Equity and Performance Management, Integrating Inclusion into Performance Reviews, Matteo will guide us through strategies for embedding equity into performance management, ensuring that inclusion is a core element of the review process. As an HR practitioner, Matteo, I'm very excited to hear this. We're coming to the end of the year, and I know a lot of us are going to be doing these sessions. So please join me in welcoming Matteo.
Awesome. Well, Zakina, thank you for that warm welcome, and to each and every one of you that are here listening to us. It's been an absolutely amazing and fabulous day. I certainly have learned a lot, and I really want to thank you for allowing me to hold space as we continue our journey of learning, and for many of us, and myself included, unlearning as well. So thank you for that. And it's interesting with this topic. One of the things I've certainly observed, not just here in North America, but really around the world, especially after George Floyd, there was such a focus and such an important focus, to the point made earlier with Anya around inclusive hiring practices, which is so excellent. That said, when we listen to the data, when we hear what's happening, for so many folks, especially for so many folks with intersectional identities that are probably different than maybe mine, what we're experiencing and what some of the researchers have called the glass cliff is that folks that get brought into the boat, with such a hyper focus on diversity and inclusion, what so many organizations have also unfortunately done is not looked at inclusion and equity throughout the entire employee lifecycle, which includes performance management, which includes things like giving feedback, includes things like performance management. Because we know for folks to truly thrive, we need feedback. People crave feedback. But when we look at the data, it's not always there. So to Sakina's point, thank you so much for introducing myself, Matteo. My pronouns are he, him. As a senior inclusive leadership facilitator, I help leaders turn great intentions into meaningful impact. And I know many of us are joining from all over the world. I'm joining you today from the traditional unceded territories of the Okanagan Silex people, also known today as West Bank or West Kelowna, British Columbia, Canada. So to that end, what we have on tap for you, what I'd love to really unpack is taking a look at performance management. And so we've got a few different things. I want to make sure that we're on the same page because, and I don't know about you, but with certainly some of the things I'm hearing out in the community, when we define a diversity, equity, inclusion, or whatever terms it is that we might be using, that we're not necessarily all in the same place. And so what I want to do is really laser focus our attention on inclusion and equity through that performance management lens. But of course, I want to make sure that we define what it is that we're talking about. And then I want to spend some time looking at the data. So my background, I have clinical specialties in internal medicine and emergency medicine. And as a clinician, it's important that we don't just do things because it feels good. It's a warm, fuzzy hug, which is great. That said, what does the data tell us? And really making data-informed decisions moving forward. And it's clear, and I'll share some of that data, and I can share some of the anecdotal stories I hear from some of the clients that, myself, I've been working with, and my colleagues here at Diversio EDU and Diversio have been working with clients as well. And so I want to talk about that, but then lead us to the now what, and really, with that acknowledgement of how we can better tomorrow than we were today, and really focusing on what are those specific things that we as leaders can do from that inclusive lens, especially as we are moving more consciously to become more inclusive and more equitable, and especially when it comes to feedback. So that said, I often get, okay, Mateo, what are you talking about here? What is this, especially talking about um, inclusion and equity in performance management. And when I mention this and have these conversations with leaders, it's interesting because I don't know if we're all necessarily on the same page. And so before we get to the how, I wanted to talk a little bit about what we mean. And I'm going to borrow, for anyone who follows this individual, Lily Zhang on LinkedIn. I certainly do, and I'm paraphrasing what they have shared in some of their LinkedIn lives. But talking about inclusion and equity, and I just want to call out that inclusion and equity, they're not the same thing, but in this context right now, through the lens of performance management, we're talking about that people's different intersectional identities, their different dimensions of diversity. That's not what impacts their success. But when we look at the data, unfortunately, that's just not the case. Unfortunately, based on people's intersectional identities, it is impacting, especially from a performance management perspective, especially when we look at the data when it comes to performance management. And unfortunately, there is strong correlations between someone's intersectional identity and the quality of feedback, the amount of feedback, the amount of actionable feedback, the words that get used in the feedback that leaders are providing them. So even though leaders have the best of intentions, I've never really met a leader that comes to me and says, I don't want my teams to thrive. I don't want my team. Most folks come with the best of intentions, but guess what? Being nice, cordial, and civil to each other isn't enough. And it's clear from the data that we need to move forward. And so I want to encourage you folks do have questions. Feel free. I know we've got a whole team here that can answer questions, and I'll make sure, to answer any questions that folks might have as really setting the table. But here's where I really want us to start thinking about is how does this show up in organizations? How does this show up in your organizations when it comes to inclusion and equity in performance, especially performance management, in those discussions that we have? And I realize too, as researchers, when we look at, what is the lived experience, often in those, one-on-ones, which we encourage many leaders, all leaders to have, we might not have data there, but there's certain points where we do have some data, and there's been some research, and I want to talk about what that lived experience is and what that data is telling us. And I think that's really crucial that we talk about that. And as well too, I will circle back to look at inclusion and equity, how we define it through the lens of performance management, and then specifically around what do we do? What's our next steps? But before we do that, I want to share with you a little bit about what, the stories that the data is telling us around these discussions that are happening out there in the community. And the first one I'll just draw your attention to. So our good friends at Fortune just released just this year, and they looked at gender and performance management. And there are some really staggering stats and sobering stats, and you can certainly read them here, but I'll just quickly, take you through some of the highlights, where 76% of what they termed high achieving individuals who identify as women received negative feedback from their leader, compared to just 2% for high achieving men. So obviously that is a very distinct differentiation. There's a distinct delta happening there. Where we're seeing women or individuals who identify as women, and this again, they also shared, individuals who identify as non. Again, we're seeing similar trends there. But what we're seeing is that women are receiving more feedback on their personality than their individuals who identify as male counterparts. So what is that telling us, right? And what does that mean in terms of the actionable feedback if the feedback is so focused on personality, but not necessarily on the behaviors that really can make an impact? And how does someone course correct if they're not getting that feedback? And the other thing too, which is interesting that Fortune looked at, is for every 1,000 words during a performance review, women experience twice as many instances of what they determined poor quality critiques compared to men, right? So the quality of the feedback is so important. The other feedback I'll share with you as well, and this is coming from our friends at Textio, and they've been doing this research for quite some time now, and they released 2 years ago, and then just now again in 2024, and unfortunately they're seeing again the same trend. So one of the data points that they looked at was what they called actionable feedback. So, getting, good boy Jim or hey, great job Lisa, that's great, but what do you do with that, right? How do you improve, right? How do you know what specific behaviors do you need to make sure that you're replicating and continue doing, or what do you need to stop or change? And if you're not getting actionable feedback, then really, I mean, what do you do with that? And when we look at it, and the first one, the top one, when we look at again the differential between those who identify as women and those who identify as men, there's a delta, right? And women receiving far more feedback that's not actionable. And then we look at gender identity, or not just gender identity, but also, for racialized individuals or for those who are identified by race or ethnicity, we're seeing some differentiations here. Very different, the lived experience, if you happen to be present as white or Asian versus Hispanic, Latino, or Black. We also saw a differential as well in terms of age cohort, right? And so what does that mean, right? For individuals who are over a certain age, we still need feedback, right? Myself included, I might have a lot of gray in the beard. That said, there's still opportunities where we crave this feedback. And so it's interesting when we look at the data, what is the data telling us around that lived experience of receiving feedback, and actionable feedback is so important. We talked about personality earlier as well, or other terms that maybe are not as actionable or maybe not as helpful in terms of what's happening. And so interesting here when we looked at personality-based feedback received by race or ethnicity. And again, and very interesting, so this has only been exemplified since they first started launching this several years ago. But when Texio released this year, when you look at words like ambitious, the differentiation for racialized or Black individuals compared to Asian, or easy to work with, or professional, or passionate. And again, this is an aggregate. Regardless of gender presentation, and again, there was differentiations within that. But interesting where someone who self-identifies as Black or is identified as Black is receiving far more percentages of the word passionate than other races. And so is that impacting? Is that highlighting some of the unconscious bias? Although we might all get along and everyone sings kumbaya and kisses trees and hugs puppies, that is this impacting the amount of feedback that someone's getting, right? Is this impacting the lived experience for somebody who is receiving and more importantly wants to move forward and really move up in their career? I'll share just a few more things. Again, this is from Textio's report, but negative feedback received by high performing employees, very similar to what Fortune released, 76% compared to 2% for individuals who identify as men. And then those who are receiving personality based feedback, and again, looking at high top performers, women are receiving it far more frequently than men. So again, the question I keep asking is, what's the story this is telling us? What's the impact? And for our teams to truly show up and thrive, to truly show up and be able to make the difference, to course correct if needed, to feel that they're feeling valued, to feel that they truly belong. And is this impacting performance, right? And when we look at the data, especially when we look at representational data at certain levels, and I'll just share in Canada, for example, since 1979, individuals who identify as women have earned 50% of all undergraduate degrees. And it's never dropped below 50% since. In fact, last year, I think Stats Canada was released that it was over 60%. Yet we're not seeing, even though that's since 1979, we still are not seeing that same level of gender representation across boardrooms. And why is that, right? A lot of different things to think about. And so one of the things, if anyone's who followed Dr. Golden's research from Harvard University, won the Nobel Prize in Economics last October, looked at, and this is one of the many factors, when here in Canada in particular, I'll just share, which was really staggering, is there was a recent study by the Prosperity Project that looked at individuals who identify women who are in the pipeline to senior leadership roles. So those roles being groomed and mentored to move up actually saw an 8% decrease year over year. And so what is that telling us? What impact is that going to have, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, if we're seeing that kind of decrease now? And why is that decrease happening? And part of that is the amount of feedback, that mentorship that's being provided. Is that equitable? And so these are all questions I'm encouraging leaders to start thinking about, because I love that hyper focus on mitigating and managing bias in hiring. We need to get more people into the boat. We need to have more diverse thoughts. We need to have more diverse perspectives. That is excellent. However, when the employees are with us, we also have to make sure that we're continuing that mindset moving forward. I'll just share again, really, really quickly, just some more, again, food for thought, more tidbits, if you will. Again, this is from Textio's research, where 78% of women recall being described as emotional versus 23% for individuals who identified as non-binary, but only 11% for individuals who identified as men. 80% of white people understood, or at least reported understood, what was required in order to move up, what they needed to do. So that what that's telling us is that they received the feedback in order to understand what they needed in order to move up in the organization. Where if someone identified as Asian, it was only 54%. So again, there's a delta there. And what we saw clear out of the data is overall individuals from equity denied, equity deserving communities, underrepresented individuals, and individuals from non-dominant groups in organizations were getting what was classified as lower quality feedback. And this is where I really want to draw our attention, because what we also know is that people who received poor feedback, whether top performers, middle performers, lower performers, regardless, whether or not they're high performers or not, if they felt they were receiving poor feedback, their tendency to want to leave an organization increased dramatically. And that's something to be mindful as well, because if we truly want to retain the best talent, the top talent, it's crucial. Top, middle, bottom, people need to know what is it they can do to improve. Just getting that, hey, great job, or getting personality-based feedback, or getting, non-actionable feedback isn't going to help someone in their career. Regardless, again, of where they are in their career, regardless of age, we know it clear from this data that people are craving feedback. So the question is, okay, Mateo, that's all nice and fancy and dancy and stuff, but what is the now what, right? What do we need to do? I'll just share quickly, and I know I don't have a slide for this, but I just want to share. So one of the clients that I'm working with really wanted to understand this even more. And so one of the two things that they're studying right now, two very simple data points. How comfortable are leaders giving feedback, and how many points of actionable feedback are being provided? Because with annual performance reviews, I mean, it's hard for them to count on one-on-ones, because again, that's, verbally, but with performance reviews, it's something that's written down, uploaded into a system, so it's an easy count. And so what they found, and they've been doing this for about 4 years now, they're entering into their fifth year, when it came to comfort level, asked a very simple question on a scale of 1 to 10, how comfortable are you giving feedback? When the leader shared similar dimensions of diversity with the individual they're giving feedback to, they scored it in the high nines. It was on a Likert scale of 1 to 10, and in the nines as an aggregate. But when the individual the leader was giving feedback to had 2 or more dimensions of diversity that were different, so it could be gender, race, sexual orientation, nerd, whatever it might have been, 2 or more, that comfort level dropped to the 2s. Then they took a look at just counting the points of feedback. So what they did is they codified it. Was it just generic, like good boy, Jim, or was it here's what you did, here's why it's important, and how to move forward? What they found is, as an aggregate, men received far more points of aggregate, far more points of actionable feedback than women. And they were expecting that. But what really surprised them was that racialized women in particular Black Canadian women in this in their organization, received statistically insignificant amounts of actionable feedback. It was negligible. So again, as much as they like to think that everyone gets along and everyone's cordial, if these individuals are not getting actionable feedback for whatever reason, how could we expect somebody to be able to advance, to be able to move forward? And I'm going to share, because I didn't really define earlier, the differences between inclusion and equity. If anyone follows Arthur Chan, another individual I follow on LinkedIn, I'm grabbing this from him with Arthur's permission, because I really like how Arthur defined this. Looking at inclusion as, and how Arthur described it as creating space for differences and treating everyone with respect, dignity, and empathy. But when you think about that, that's the cognitive behavioral change. So when you think about that as, for organizations, how are we developing our leaders and our frontline staff? And what are those cognitive behavioral changes that we can make to set the table for inclusion? Equity, acknowledging the systemic barriers, prioritizing access, opportunities, and resources. That was systemic change or system change. And again, those are things that as an organization, we can have an impact. So if we want to focus on inclusion and equity from a performance management lens, what does that mean? It means that we're going to need to take a look at both cognitive behavioral change with our leaders and with our frontline teams, as well as the systems changes within the organization. So taking a look at that first one around cognitive and behavioral changes, here's a few of the things that we certainly highly recommend. One is understanding intersectionality, understanding that folks are coming with a lot of different intersectional parts to their identity. People are not just one part of their identity. And also as leaders, understanding their lived experience, how they might have, and how they might continue to interpret and hear the messages that you're giving in performance reviews or in feedback, but through a trauma-informed lens. Now, that doesn't mean let's wrap everyone in bubble wrap and put kid gloves on. No, really truly holding folks to account. That said, understanding that, when and I'll just take an aside, when I talk with a lot of leaders, I say, tell me about the investments you put into performance management. And I always hear, how much time and effort gets put into training a leader on how do you fill out the performance feedback form, which is great, but how much time do we spend on building up folks' competency, not only giving feedback, but also receiving feedback? When folks leave university, are they truly ready, or wherever they might be leaving, when they leave school or wherever job they might have been coming from? Are they ready to also receive and internalize that feedback? And we don't know, from previous, managers they might have had or leaders, what trauma they might have had, what traumas they might have had in the past in terms of receiving feedback. And I say trauma, but, that previous lived experience. So again, what ongoing support are we offering to create that feedback-rich, feedback-safe environment? This is going to be a lot of both mindset training and coaching and development for people leaders, for leaders who are leading people leaders, as well as for our frontline teams to be able to receive feedback. In my day, and I say my day, back in the 80s and early 90s, back in the late 1900s, as a lot of folks will remind me, our focus was on, you got the feedback and you just ran with it. You said, yes, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, and you did it. But now we need to better understand how folks are internalizing that feedback, again, through that intersectional trauma-informed lens, so that we can really adjust and help our folks through that. And a big part of that came out of this is this is not you do it once and everyone gets it right. And I think I heard this earlier on one of the panels. It's an iterative process that's going to require a lot of self-reflection, a lot of folks to really take ownership around their own unconscious biases. And I know that's for a lot of folks in our space, it's a bit of a dirty word, and we have to be able to move past that, because clear of the data, right? Clear from that client I was sharing, we know we're racialized women, we're not receiving any, it was statistically insignificant amounts of actionable feedback. We need to do some self-reflection. Comfort level was low, and the actual amount of feedback provided was statistically insignificant. So there's work to be done. So if we're not doing that self-reflective process, if we're not holding to account, so it's one thing to create a safer and braver space, but are we also setting the table for a more accountable space? And this is where that cognitive and behavioral change. And then of course, there's also systemic change as well. And I'll highlight a few points that I'd love just in a few moments that I have left with you, just talking about this. One is again taking that intersectional lens approach, looking at our policy reviews. And one of the things I challenge is how many times do organizations spend the time, invest that time doing bias checks and bias audits in their policies, in their procedures, right? In both those written and also unwritten ways of doing business. Because culture isn't just the foosball tables and the pizza parties. It's what gets allowed. It's all those little things. And when I think about culture, it goes beyond just, here's what we have on paper or here's what's uploaded into our SharePoint site. It's also those behaviors that are happening on your teams that you may or may not be aware of as leaders or as an organization. And so how often are we doing these bias audits, these bias reviews and checks? And that's going to take a lot of personal reflection and a lot of, for some folks, swallowing some pride and being able to truly move forward. The other thing that comes up is around transparency and expectations. And I think, everyone will say that, but that's going to mean, different things for different organizations, depending on how large the organization, how complex, but that's going to be important. Again, the ongoing training, support, and coaching. But to my point on the previous slide, moving beyond just here's how you fill out the form, or here's the feedback model we want you to use. How are we coaching and preparing folks to be able to receive the feedback and use that feedback and utilize that feedback? Do we understand how people are internalizing the things that we said? That message sent versus message received, the best of intentions don't always equal the impact that we want. At the end of the day, why are we doing this? Because we want to see behavioral change. Well, to do that, how are we getting that? Right? So again, it's that notion around leader accountability. I like to call it that feedback safe, feedback rich environment. And that is not just something that, you roll out one training program and write a policy and call it a day. This is an ongoing support. The other thing too is, and I like to think of this as, moving away, not just say moving away from just annual performance reviews, but making sure that that one-on-one time that leaders are focused on, not just one-on-one to let's solve for whatever problem that you're dealing with right now, but that truly one-on-one time to listen with it. And what we find too in the data is that one-on-one time isn't always done equitably. And there could be factors, many times it often could be for a variety of reasons. And what I find, especially when we sit down with our clients, is it's not necessarily always equitable. And unfortunately, sometimes people's intersectional identities might impact how frequently, how often, and the quality of that one-on-one time. And so just some general tips for around inclusive performance management is yes, there needs to be structural support for this to be able to happen. And with that structural support, understanding what I love this term, bias disruption and bias audits, if you will. And how do we encourage folks to have that Kaizen methodology or that self-assessment and truly understand what that, from that both, bravery and humility perspective. And this transition to more frequent conversations around not only the check-ins, but around performance management. So it's not where you're waiting, a year to hear about stuff that happened 8, 9, 10 months ago, but you're really having more frequent conversations around performance and how to truly level up. The other one too, and this one is one that I'm open to have longer conversations on, is how do we acknowledge this challenge in addressing leader bias? Because without it, I mean, it's clear, time and time again, and like that, these examples I shared with from Textio, from Fortune, and from the other client I shared, biases are still impacting. They're not just impacting they're not just, well, they're impacting performance, they're impacting all stages of an employee's life cycle. If you were with us earlier, my dear colleague Jasmine talked a lot about understanding and taking a lens looking at neurodiversity, because a lot of the systems we built have really built from the neurodominant perspective, and that goes, all throughout society. And so I'd be remiss without just touching on and continuing that conversation that Jasmine had with us around neurodiversity, but through the lens of inclusion and equity in performance management. And one of the things that's come, and if you're interested, highly recommend, University of Calgary is doing some amazing research on this right now, looking at how we even frame, because as a clinician, we always framed neurodiversity as a medical diagnosis, something that we, use our medical diagnostic tools to assess and then to treat. But what if we framed it as not a medical diagnosis, but rather a natural variation of the human condition? What impact would that have on our organization? What impact would that have on the systems? What impact would that have on our policies and procedures? And part of this, when we look at not only cognitive inclusion, but social inclusion, emotional inclusion, physical sensory inclusion, part of this is how do we personalize that feedback? How do we set, and I like what they recommended is set clearer, and then we put the in brackets the ER, because every leader will say, "Oh, I set clear expectations." But again, forcing us with that self-reflection to go, right, is that's clear, but that's clear from the neurodominant perspective. Is that clear from all perspectives? And just really challenging ourselves on that. Taking a strength-based approach has been found to be very beneficial in terms of improving performance. Again, there's a plethora of resources. It's interesting too, when we talk about neurodominant culture, when I know with CCDI, when we looked at a lot of the resources were all from, if you're a leader who, and again, the former term, neurotypical, how do you support someone with neurodiversity, but never if you are a leader who is neurodiverse, how do you lead your team? And so again, getting us to really think about the resources that are available and flipping that paradigm and that paradigm of thinking, more frequent check-ins, creating a supportive environment. And how do we promote as leaders and as organizations, promote neurodiversity awareness, especially through that lens of performance management? Again, it's not about the wrapping everyone in bubble wrap and kids gloves. We still need to have a brave and accountable space. That said, it's looking at the how the messages are being delivered and verifying and validating how they're being received and how important that is. I know I have taken up a lot of time. I want to
Got
make sure
great
we have time for
questions.
questions. We got great. Okay, great. Let's hear some. I love it.
Thanks so much, Mateo. That's fantastic context. I want to make sure we have lots of time left for Laura to talk about mental wellness in the final session. But we have a question that is tailor-made for you, Mateo.
Okay.
In healthcare,
Ah.
employees' work is often measured by patient outcomes,
Mhm.
which can vary significantly based on external factors. How can we
Right.
ensure that performance reviews in this field are equitable and account for different challenges employees face, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds?
I love it. So thank you for that. And the reason why I'm laughing is, so one of the boards I sit on is for a healthcare organization here in the interior of BC. And this conversation came up last night at our board meeting. And so I don't know if I'm going to be able to provide the full answer in 30 seconds or less. But here are some of the tips in terms of the things that we discussed last night. One was really, again, because every organization is different, especially in healthcare, but start conceptualizing what are the performance metrics, and do we need to either adjust expectations, recognizing things like patient outcomes can be influenced by numerous external factors such as, social economic status, community resources, patient engagement, but really adjust performance expectations based on these variables rather than applying a one size fits all standard, right? So whether that's pediatric psych to emerge to internal medicine, but using a range of both qualitative and quantitative measures beyond patient outcomes. So considering things like patient satisfaction scores, teamwork, things like even adherence to protocols, and professional development contributions, because we've seen that adherence to protocols combined with professional development contributions have also seen higher levels of things like lower levels of infection control. So there's things that we can look at. What are those leading and lagging indicators to drive success? But of course, I mean, we talk about this, providing supportive resources, access to training. The other thing too is mentorship
Okay.
programs and opportunities. So I know that's a lot, but that's just, it gives you a sample of some for that.
Thanks so much. We've got a few more questions, and I have the go ahead to use our 5 minute break
Awesome.
to answer some of these questions. And then we're going to move over, and our CEO, Laura, is going to close the day. But let's see if how many of these questions we can get through.
Oh,
We
awesome.
have a great one here
Mhm.
that in these studies that you were showing at the beginning, someone was popping right up, a lot of interest in these
Mhm.
studies. Do you know if they looked at the demographics of who was providing the feedback? And I
Yeah,
feel like you talked about that a little bit later
yeah,
on when you said,
yeah.
how comfortable are you?
Yeah. So here's what they found. It's interesting. Both Fortune, Textio, I'm going to mention the one that I mentioned, which was one of the clients. What they found, and again, it all is they found, and because they looked at all levels of the organization, they looked at feedback that a supervisor was writing to, an individual contributor, a people, a supervisor of other supervisors, as well as executives. And what they found is as they moved up in the organization, and you see this in many organizations, especially from a North American and UK context, is that the leaders tend to look and sound like,
Right.
right? And so what they found is that as that skewed up, it did impact, right? And so that was interesting. But again, they also saw too in the data that even when an individual, the senior leader who was an executive who was providing feedback again to someone who didn't share dimensions of diversity, again that confidence level dropped. So, for example, from someone who's a racialized individual providing feedback to someone who is, maybe presents or identifies as white or presents as part of the 2S LGBTQ to us LGBTQ community, and they identified it as heterosexual or straight, and or cisgender to trans. Again, confidence levels drop significantly.
Right.
But again, when you looked at the leader, again, the leader demographics tended to skew more cisgendered, able-bodied white male as
Right.
they moved up in the organization.
Okay. I've got an interesting one here in the not-for-profit sector.
Okay, yeah.
We rely heavily on collaborative work and shared goals. Team achievements are often prioritized over individual
Hmm.
contributions. But how can our small but decent-sized organization, how do we integrate equity into those performance evaluations?
I love it. And it's interesting to the person that's a very valuable question. It's interesting. As I sit on several nonprofit boards. One of the things we look at is really defining both team and individual metrics and having that balanced evaluation criteria. And of course, having very specific roles and responsibilities happens. One of the things too is how do we foster an inclusive feedback culture that moves beyond just the traditional, annual performance review. So again, getting into more frequent 360-degree feedback. How do we get more regular check-ins and creating more opportunities for individual recognition of both spotlighting the individual contributions on the teams, and that can be from everything from brown bag events to team meetings, newsletters, to more formalized and informal recognition. And the other one too that we use quite frequently in the nonprofits that I'm working with now is encouraging self-assessments. Because
Right.
oftentimes, too, folks are the hardest on themselves when it comes
Yep.
to that evaluation, and being able to provide more frequent self-evaluation tools that then can be used with the leader in their one-on-ones. Because in nonprofits, you're under-resourced and got too much to do. But what we found is those more frequent self-evaluations have really helped in terms of the conversations that the leaders are having.
Okay.
So hopefully
I want to
that's a
try to
help start.
I want to sneak one more in
Okay,
because I'm
awesome.
really interested in your opinion on this. I'm
Mhm.
not sure if we have data to back it up, but an anonymous attendee said, why do you think women are receiving such a disproportionate amount of negative feedback compared to men, especially when you identified that both seem to be high performing
Yeah,
individuals?
yeah. Let's just call it out. Let's call it what it is. Bias. Whether
Oh,
you like it or not, let's call it what it is. Let's just, here's what it is. Let's call that out, right? Bias exists. We see it every day, every day. And I know people are, hesitant to speak to it or call it out, but we need to really just say, this is what it is. It still exists. You might everyone gets cordial and everyone gets along and everyone's civil to each other. Moot point if the impact is still not there, right?
right.
Best of intentions don't always equal impact, and we have to circle back to that. If we don't call that out, then all we're doing is we're just let's do diversity for performative and call that what it is. But if we truly want to move forward to inclusion, we have to be able to come and have an honest, robust conversation about the impact gender, race, and other biases are having, especially when someone is perceived to be othered.
Right.
from the dominant group. Let's call that out, call it what it is, have a robust, guilt-free, shame-free, no judgment conversation about it so that we can truly move forward. Otherwise, we're just going to be in a circle of a pattern of behavior that is not moving us forward as teams and as organizations.
Thank you so much.